The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle as Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge, stood before her bedroom mirror. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the simple black dress she had chosen for the day. Today was different from all the royal engagements she had attended before. Today, she and William would make a decision that would touch the hearts of millions. Though they didn't know it yet, William entered the room quietly, his face carrying the weight of recent conversations with palace advisors. The couple had been discussing something deeply personal for weeks, a gesture that went against royal protocol but felt absolutely necessary to their hearts. Catherine turned to face her husband, seeing the same mixture of determination and nervousness in his eyes that she felt in her own chest. "Are you certain about this?" William asked softly, taking her hands in his. They both knew that what they were about to do would create waves throughout the monarchy and beyond. It wasn't about grand speeches or official ceremonies. It was about something much more human, much more real. The idea had come to them during a quiet evening at Kensington Palace 3 weeks earlier. They had been reading bedtime stories to their children when George, their eldest, had asked a question that stopped them both in their tracks. The innocence of childhood had a way of cutting straight to the heart of complex adult situations, and that night, George's words had planted a seed that grew into something they could no longer ignore. Catherine remembered how she and William had looked at each other across the children's bedroom, both understanding immediately what needed to be done. They had spent years following royal protocols, maintaining proper distances, and ensuring every public appearance was perfectly orchestrated. But sometimes, the most important moments required throwing away the rulebook entirely. The palace staff had been divided when William and Catherine first mentioned their plan. Some advisors warned about the potential backlash, the criticism from traditionalists, and the media frenzy that would surely follow. Others understood the deeper significance of what the couple wanted to accomplish and quietly supported their decision. As Catherine applied the last touches of her makeup, she thought about the family they would visit today. The Johnsons were not royalty, not celebrities, not politicians. They were ordinary people facing an extraordinary tragedy. And somehow their story had reached the hearts of the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge in a way that formal briefings and official reports never could. William checked his watch and took a deep breath. Their security detail was already in position, but today's visit would be different from their usual royal engagements. There would be no red carpets, no ceremonial welcomes, and no carefully choreographed photo opportunities. Instead, there would be something far more powerful, genuine, human connection in its purest form. The couple made their way through the castle corridors, their footsteps echoing in the ancient halls where centuries of British royalty had walked before them. Today, they carried the weight of modern monarchy on their shoulders. But they also carried something else, the simple desire to comfort another family in their darkest hour. Catherine's mind wandered to her own children, safely at school at this moment, unaware that their parents were about to take a step that would redefine what it meant to be royal in the 21st century. She and William had always tried to give George, Charlotte, and Louis as normal a childhood as possible within the constraints of their position. Today's gesture was an extension of those same values. As they approached their waiting car, William paused and looked at his wife. In that moment, they were not the future King and Queen of England. They were simply two parents who understood that sometimes the most important thing you can do is show up for someone else, regardless of protocols or consequences. The drive to their destination would take 45 minutes through the English countryside. During that journey, they would each process their own thoughts about what lay ahead. They knew that by evening, the spontaneous act of compassion would be analyzed, debated, and discussed by millions of people around the world. But right now, in this quiet moment before everything changed, William and Catherine were focused on just one thing: being present for a family who needed to know they were not alone in their grief. The decision they had made would soon touch hearts across the globe, proving that even in an age of carefully managed public relations, authentic human kindness still had the power to move mountains. Their car pulled away from Windsor Castle. carrying them toward a moment that would be remembered long after the formal ceremonies and state dinners were forgotten. Sometimes, the most significant royal duties are the ones that never appear on any official schedule. The Johnson family home sat quietly on Maple Street, a modest two-story house with a small garden where roses still bloomed despite the family's recent heartbreak. Sarah Johnson stood at her kitchen window, watching neighbors come and go with casseroles and condolence cards, though she barely registered their kindness. Her world had been shattered 2 weeks ago when her 7-year-old daughter, Emma, had lost her brave battle with leukemia. David Johnson sat in Emma's bedroom, surrounded by stuffed animals and drawings that still covered the walls. He hadn't been able to bring himself to change anything since that terrible morning at the hospital. The room still smelled faintly of the strawberry shampoo Emma had insisted on using, and her favorite book lay open on the bedside table exactly where she had left it. The couple had been married for 12 years, but grief had created a distance between them that felt impossible to bridge. Sarah found herself cooking meals that no one ate, while David threw himself into work projects that didn't really matter anymore. They moved through their daily routines like sleepwalkers, each lost in their own private version of devastation. Emma had been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia just after her 6th birthday. The initial prognosis had been hopeful, and for nearly 2 years, the Johnson family had lived in a world of hospital visits, treatment schedules, and cautious optimism. Emma had faced every chemotherapy session with remarkable courage, often comforting other children in the cancer ward who were newer to the journey. During her treatment, Emma had become fascinated with stories about princesses and castles. She had filled countless hours during her hospital stays by drawing pictures of royal families and imagining herself as a brave princess who helped other sick children feel better. Her favorite drawing, which still hung on the refrigerator, showed a smiling princess with a crown, made of colorful flowers visiting children in hospital beds. The local newspaper had featured Emma's story several months earlier as part of a series about young cancer fighters. The article had mentioned her dream of someday visiting a real castle and meeting an actual princess. Readers had been touched by Emma's positive spirit despite her difficult circumstances, and the story had been shared widely on social media by people who were moved by her resilience when Emma's condition took a sudden turn for the worse. The Johnson family had focused entirely on spending every precious moment together. The hospital room had been filled with family members, friends, and even some of the medical staff who had grown to love Emma during her long treatment journey. In her final days, she had continued to draw pictures and tell stories about kind princesses who made everyone feel better. Sarah remembered Emma's last coherent conversation, when she had whispered about wanting to make sure other children wouldn't be as scared as she had been in the beginning. Even facing her own mortality, Emma had been thinking about how to help others. It was a level of maturity and compassion that had amazed everyone who knew her. The funeral had been attended by hundreds of people, including classmates, teachers, hospital staff, and complete strangers who had followed Emma's story. The small church had overflowed with mourners who had been touched by one little girl's extraordinary courage. Local news stations had covered the service, focusing on the remarkable impact Emma had made during her short life. In the days following the funeral, cards and letters had poured in from around the world. People shared stories about how Emma's brave example had inspired them to face their own challenges with greater courage. Parents of other sick children wrote to thank the Johnson family for sharing Emma's story, which had helped their own families feel less alone. David had tried to return to his job at the local bank, but found it impossible to concentrate on mortgage applications and loan paperwork when his heart felt completely broken. Sarah had taken extended leave from her position as a school librarian, unable to imagine being around children when the absence of her own daughter felt so overwhelming. The couple had begun seeing a grief counselor, though neither felt ready to fully engage in the healing process. They knew intellectually that Emma would want them to eventually find joy again, but emotionally they felt trapped in a fog of sadness that seemed impenetrable. Well-meaning friends and family members offered comfort and advice, But nothing seemed to reach the depth of their pain. As Sarah continued staring out the kitchen window, she noticed an unusual amount of activity on their quiet street. Several cars with official-looking license plates had appeared, along with what appeared to be security personnel positioned at various points around the neighborhood. She mentioned it to David, who came downstairs to investigate. But neither could make sense of what was happening. Their doorbell had rung several times that morning, but they had stopped answering it days ago, overwhelmed by the constant stream of visitors offering condolences. Now, however, the doorbell rang in a pattern that seemed somehow different, more patient and respectful than the usual quick bursts from neighbors or delivery personnel. David hesitated at the front door, his hand resting on the handle as the gentle knocking continued. Through the frosted glass he could make out the shapes of two people standing on his doorstep. But something about their posture suggested this wasn't another neighbor bringing food or a reporter seeking a statement. Sarah joined him in the hallway, both of them still wearing the clothes they had slept in, their hair uncombed and eyes red from weeks of crying. When David finally opened the door, the world seemed to stop. Standing before them, without fanfare or formal announcement, were Prince William and Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge. They weren't surrounded by photographers or accompanied by palace officials. Instead, they stood quietly on the Johnson family's modest doorstep, their faces filled with genuine compassion and their hands empty. Except for a simple bouquet of white roses, Sarah felt her knees weaken as she gripped David's arm. In all their years of following royal news and ceremonies, she had never imagined that members of the royal family would appear at her door, especially not during the darkest period of her life. Catherine stepped forward first, her voice soft and filled with warmth as she spoke words that would echo in the Johnson family's hearts forever. "We're so deeply sorry for your loss," Catherine said, her own eyes beginning to fill with tears. "We read about Emma, and we just had to come. We hope you don't mind that we didn't call first. But sometimes these moments can't wait for proper arrangements." William nodded, his usually composed royal demeanor replaced by the raw emotion of a father who couldn't imagine losing one of his own children. "Emma sounded like an extraordinary little girl," he added quietly. "We know nothing we say can take away your pain. But we wanted you to know that her story has touched our hearts and the hearts of our children as well." David found himself unable to speak, overwhelmed by the surreal nature of the moment. Here were two of the most famous people in the world, standing in his doorway, talking about his daughter as if she had been someone truly special rather than just another child who had lost her battle with cancer. The genuine emotion in their voices made it clear that this wasn't a publicity stunt or royal obligation. Sarah managed to invite them inside, her voice barely above a whisper. As the royal couple entered their modest living room, they seemed completely comfortable despite the stark difference between their usual palaces and the Johnson family's simple home. Catherine immediately noticed the photographs of Emma that covered every surface, and she spent several minutes studying each one with genuine interest. "She had such a beautiful smile," Catherine observed, picking up a picture of Emma in her hospital bed, wearing a paper crown and grinning despite the tubes and wires surrounding her. "You can see the light in her eyes even during her treatment. That kind of spirit is incredibly rare." William sat down beside David on the couch, man to man, father to father. "We brought something," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. "Our children wanted Emma to have this." He pulled out a small, hand-drawn card signed by George, Charlotte, and Louis. The artwork was simple but heartfelt, showing stick figures of the royal children playing with another little girl under a rainbow. The gesture broke something open in David's chest, and for the first time since Emma's death, he began to sob, not the angry, bitter tears he had been shedding alone, but the cleansing tears of a father whose grief was being witnessed and honored by other parents who understood the preciousness of children. Catherine sat with Sarah, and without any prompting, Sarah began sharing stories about Emma's dreams and drawings. She brought out the picture Emma had drawn of the princes visiting sick children, and Catherine's composure finally cracked completely. Tears streamed down the Duchess's face as she held the drawing, seeing her own role through the eyes of a dying child who had dreamed of bringing comfort to others. She drew this? Catherine asked, her voice breaking. She imagined a princess helping other children feel better? When Sarah nodded, Catherine looked at William with an expression that conveyed everything they were both thinking. This little girl had understood something about service and compassion that many adults never grasped. The four adults sat together in the Johnson family's living room for nearly 2 hours. There were no photographers, no press releases, and no official statements. There was just genuine human connection between two families bound together by love for children and an understanding that some moments transcend social status or royal protocol. William shared stories about his own children's fears and worries, making David and Sarah feel less alone in their parental concerns. Catherine talked about the challenges of balancing public duties with family life, but always bringing the conversation back to Emma and the impact her story had made. As the visit continued, something shifted in the Johnson home. The oppressive weight of grief didn't disappear, but it became somehow more bearable when shared with people who truly understood the value of what had been lost. The royal couple's presence validated Emma's worth in a way that formal condolences never could. When it came time for William and Catherine to leave, they didn't hurry through polite goodbyes. Instead, they lingered, clearly reluctant to end a connection that had become meaningful to all of them. Catherine hugged Sarah tightly, and William shook David's hand with the firmness of genuine respect. As they prepared to depart, Catherine made a promise that surprised everyone, including William. Her words would soon create ripples that extended far beyond the Johnson family's living room. Catherine's promise had been spontaneous, spoken from the heart without consideration for royal protocols or palace schedules. Emma's drawing will have a special place at Kensington Palace, she had said, carefully taking the picture from Sarah's hands. And we're going to make sure that her dream of helping other sick children becomes real somehow. As William and Catherine's car pulled away from Maple Street, both were quiet, processing what had just happened. They had arrived with the simple intention of offering comfort to grieving parents, but they were leaving with something much more significant. A mission that Emma herself had unknowingly assigned to them through her innocent artwork and generous spirit. William was the first to speak as their car headed back toward London. "We can't just let this end here," he said, his voice filled with determination. That little girl understood something about using position to help others that we sometimes forget in all our formal duties. Catherine nodded, still holding Emma's drawing carefully in her lap. "I keep thinking about all the children in hospitals right now who are scared and alone, just like Emma was in the beginning. What if we could actually make her dream come true? What if we could create something that brings comfort to sick children everywhere?" The idea began to take shape during their drive back to the palace. They envisioned a program that would bring joy and comfort to children facing serious illnesses, inspired by Emma's vision of a kind princess who helped others feel better. It wouldn't be another formal royal charity with committees and bureaucracy. Instead, it would be something personal and direct, funded by their own resources and guided by Emma's simple wisdom. When they arrived at Kensington Palace, William and Catherine immediately called their children into the sitting room. They explained about their visit to Emma's family and showed George, Charlotte, and Louis the picture Emma had drawn. The royal children listened with wide eyes as their parents described Emma's courage and her dream of helping other sick children. 8-year-old George studied Emma's drawing carefully before asking a question that surprised both his parents. "Can we visit the sick children too?" he asked. Emma wanted to help them, but now she can't. Maybe we could help them for her? Charlotte, now 6, immediately understood the connection between Emma's story and her own privileged life. "We have lots of toys and books," she observed. Emma probably would have shared hers if she could. Even 3-year-old Louis seemed to grasp that they were talking about something important, though he expressed it simply by asking if the sick children needed hugs that evening. While their children played in another room, William and Catherine sat at their kitchen table and began planning what would become known as Emma's Dream Project. They decided to start small, with personal visits to children's hospitals, bringing books, games, and most importantly, genuine attention and care to young patients who were fighting their own battles. Catherine carefully placed Emma's drawing in a frame and hung it in their private family room, where she would see it every day. The picture became a reminder of their promise and a symbol of how children often understand kindness better than adults who get caught up in rules and procedures. Word of the royal couple's unannounced visit to the Johnson family began to spread through their quiet neighborhood. Neighbors who had witnessed the unusual security presence and recognized the distinctive royal vehicles started sharing the story on social media. However, the posts weren't critical or gossipy. Instead, they were filled with admiration for the genuine compassion William and Catherine had shown Mrs. Henderson, who lived next door to the Johnson family, posted on Facebook about seeing the Duchess of Cambridge wiping tears from her eyes as she left the house. Her post was shared thousands of times by people who were moved by the image of royalty showing such authentic emotion. The story began trending under the hashtag Emma's Angels. Created by someone who had been following Emma's journey from the beginning, local news stations picked up the story. But unusually, they approached it with respect rather than sensationalism. Reporters who interviewed neighbors focused on the impact of the visit rather than critiquing royal protocol. Even traditionally critical media outlets seemed to recognize that this was a moment that transcended their usual cynicism about royal activities. The Palace communications team found themselves in an unusual position. Normally, royal visits were carefully planned and officially announced, with detailed itineraries and coordinated media coverage. This spontaneous visit had caught them completely off guard. But the public response was overwhelmingly positive, making it impossible to frame the story as anything other than a genuine act of compassion. Meanwhile, David and Sarah Johnson were experiencing something they hadn't felt since Emma's death: hope. Not hope that their grief would disappear or that they would stop missing their daughter, but hope that Emma's life had mattered in ways they were only beginning to understand. The royal visit had validated their daughter's worth and transformed her memory into something that could bring comfort to other families. Sarah found herself able to eat a full meal for the first time in weeks, while David managed to sleep through the night without waking up crying. They began receiving messages from parents of other sick children, sharing their own stories and expressing gratitude that Emma's dream was being honored by people with the power to make real change. The ripple effects of that quiet afternoon visit were growing larger by the hour, touching hearts across the country and around the world. What had started as a simple act of human kindness was becoming something much more significant, a reminder that authentic compassion could still move people in an age of carefully managed public relations and calculated gestures. As news of Emma's dream project began to leak out through various sources, anticipation built around what William and Catherine would do next. The couple found themselves in the unique position of having made a promise to a grieving family that had captured the attention of millions of people who were waiting to see how royalty would honor the memory of one extraordinary little girl. 3 weeks after their visit to the Johnson family, Catherine stood outside the children's cancer ward at Great Ormond Street Hospital, holding a carefully prepared bag of books and art supplies. Unlike her usual royal visits, there were no photographers waiting, no red carpets, and no formal reception committee. She had quietly arranged this visit through personal contacts, wanting to honor Emma's memory without turning it into a media spectacle. William had remained at home with their children, who were helping him prepare care packages for other hospitals. The entire family had thrown themselves into Emma's dream project with an enthusiasm that surprised even the palace staff. George had donated several of his favorite books. Charlotte had made dozens of handmade cards, and Louis had carefully selected stuffed animals from his own collection. As Catherine entered the ward, she was greeted by Dr. Amanda Stevens, the head pediatric oncologist who had agreed to facilitate this informal visit. Dr. Stevens had worked with hundreds of young cancer patients over her career, but she had never experienced a royal visit quite like this one. There was an intimacy and authenticity to Catherine's presence that made it feel more like a friend visiting than a formal royal engagement. The first child Catherine met was 6-year-old Marcus, who was halfway through his chemotherapy treatment for brain cancer. His mother sat beside his bed, exhausted from weeks of sleeping in hospital chairs and watching her son fight for his life. When Catherine approached, Marcus immediately recognized her despite his medication-induced drowsiness. "Are you really a princess?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Catherine sat down beside his bed and smiled, immediately putting him at ease with her gentle manner and genuine interest in his story. "I am," Catherine replied. "And I heard that you're incredibly brave. A little girl named Emma wanted me to tell all the brave children like you that you're not alone." She pulled out one of George's favorite adventure books and began reading to Marcus, her voice filling the quiet room with stories of courage and friendship. As word spread through the ward that the Duchess of Cambridge was visiting, other families began to gather around. Unlike formal royal visits where access was strictly controlled, this gathering felt organic and natural. Parents who had been maintaining brave faces for their children began to show their own vulnerability as Catherine listened to their stories with genuine empathy. 8-year-old Lily, who was receiving treatment for leukemia just as Emma had, showed Catherine a drawing she had made of herself as a superhero fighting cancer cells. Catherine was visibly moved by the artwork, recognizing the same spirit that had inspired Emma's drawings. She spent nearly an hour with Lily, discussing art techniques and sharing stories about her own children's creative projects. The hospital staff watched in amazement as Catherine moved from bed to bed, spending meaningful time with each child and family. She wasn't following a schedule or trying to cover maximum ground for publicity purposes. Instead, she was fully present for each interaction, giving every child the feeling that they were the most important person in the room. When Catherine met 10-year-old James, who had been battling cancer for over a year, he surprised her with a question that stopped her in her tracks. "Did Emma really draw a picture of a princess like you helping kids like us?" he asked, when Catherine nodded and showed him a photo of Emma's drawing. James smiled for the first time in weeks, according to his parents. "Emma was smart," James observed with the wisdom that often comes from facing serious illness at a young age. "She knew that sometimes when you're really sick, you just need someone to care about you who doesn't have to." His insight touched Catherine deeply, confirming her belief that this project was about much more than charitable duty. Dr. Stevens later told colleagues that she had never seen children respond to a visitor the way they responded to Catherine that day. The Duchess had somehow created an atmosphere where sick children felt comfortable being themselves rather than putting on brave faces for another adult who would eventually leave them behind. As Catherine prepared to leave the hospital after spending nearly 4 hours in the ward, she made another spontaneous decision that would further expand Emma's legacy. She asked Dr. Stevens if the hospital would be interested in participating in a regular program where members of her family would make unannounced visits to bring comfort and normalcy to young patients. The idea of informal, ongoing royal support for seriously ill children was unprecedented in modern British history. Traditional royal patronages involved formal ceremonies and structured fundraising events, but Catherine was proposing something much more personal and direct. She wanted to create a program where royal family members would simply show up to read stories, play games, and provide human connection to children who were fighting for their lives. Dr. Stevens immediately recognized the potential impact of such a program. Many of her young patients spent months in the hospital, becoming isolated from normal childhood experiences. The prospect of regular visits from people who genuinely cared about their well-being could provide emotional support that medical treatment alone couldn't address. When Catherine returned to Kensington Palace that evening, she found William and their children eagerly waiting to hear about her hospital visit. She described each child she had met, showing them drawings and cards that young patients had given her to share with George, Charlotte, and Louis, the royal children, listened with fascination as their mother described the courage and resilience of children their own ages who were facing challenges they could barely imagine. The experience deepened their understanding of their own privilege and their responsibility to use their position to help others. That night, as Catherine tucked her own children into their beds in their comfortable palace rooms, she thought about the children she had left behind in hospital beds, fighting battles that no child should have to face. Emma's dream of a kind princess helping sick children was becoming a reality, but it was also becoming something bigger, a bridge between royal privilege and human need that honored the best of both worlds. The media began to catch wind of Catherine's hospital visit through social media posts from grateful parents and hospital staff. However, the tone of the coverage was different from typical royal reporting. Instead of focusing on fashion choices or protocol details, journalists found themselves writing about genuine human connection and the power of showing up for people in their darkest moments. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Sarah Johnson stood in the gardens of Kensington Palace, surrounded by dozens of families whose lives had been touched by childhood illness. The occasion was the official launch of the Emma Johnson Foundation for Young Patients, a charity that had grown far beyond anything William and Catherine had originally imagined when they first knocked on the Johnson family door. The foundation had evolved organically from those initial hospital visits into a comprehensive support network for families dealing with serious childhood illnesses. What made it unique wasn't just the royal patronage, but the deeply personal approach that had been inspired by Emma's own understanding of what sick children needed most, genuine human connection and the knowledge that they weren't forgotten. David Johnson watched his wife as she prepared to speak to the gathered crowd, marveling at the transformation that had occurred in both of their lives. The crushing grief hadn't disappeared, but it had been joined by something else, purpose. Emma's death had created a void that nothing could fill, but her memory had become a source of light for other families walking the same difficult path. Prince William stood at the podium, looking out at an audience that included not just dignitaries and charity officials, but children in wheelchairs, parents who had barely slept in months, and medical professionals who had dedicated their lives to fighting childhood diseases. His speech wasn't filled with the formal language typical of royal charity events, but with personal reflections on what he had learned from Emma's story. Emma Johnson never met my family, William began, his voice carrying across the garden, but she taught us something profound about the responsibility that comes with privilege. She showed us that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply show up for someone who needs to know they're not alone. Catherine sat in the front row with George, Charlotte, and Louis, who had become integral parts of the foundation's work. The royal children regularly accompanied their parents on hospital visits, bringing games, books, and the normalizing presence of other kids who simply wanted to play and have fun. Their involvement had helped countless young patients feel less isolated from typical childhood experiences. The foundation had grown to include not just hospital visits, but also a network of support services for families dealing with childhood illness. There were emergency financial assistance programs for parents who had to take extended time off work, counseling services for siblings who often felt overlooked during medical crises, and educational support for children whose schooling was interrupted by treatment. Most importantly, the foundation had maintained the personal touch that had characterized that first spontaneous visit to the Johnson family. Every program was designed around the principle that families dealing with serious illness needed more than just financial support. They needed to feel valued, heard, and connected to a community that understood their challenges. Dr. Amanda Stevens, who had become the foundation's medical advisor, often told colleagues that the Emma Johnson Foundation had revolutionized how they thought about supporting young patients. The combination of royal attention and genuine grassroots compassion had created something unprecedented in the world of childhood illness support. As Sarah stepped up to the microphone, she looked out at faces that had become familiar over the past months, parents she had met in hospital waiting rooms, children who had inspired her with their courage, and medical professionals who had shared their expertise and passion. The foundation had given her grief a purpose while honoring everything Emma had represented. Emma drew her picture of a kind princess, helping sick children because she believed that love could make even the scariest situations better, Sarah said, her voice strong despite the emotion she felt. She never got to see her dream become real, but somehow she made it possible for all of us to carry it forward together. The crowd was quiet as Sarah continued, many wiping away tears as she described how the foundation's work reflected Emma's own generous spirit. Parents nodded in recognition as she talked about the isolation and fear that often accompanied childhood illness, and how simple acts of kindness could provide light in the darkest moments. Catherine rose to present Sarah with a framed photograph that had been taken during one of the foundation's recent hospital visits. It showed a group of young patients gathered around Prince George as he read from the same book Catherine had shared with Marcus on that first informal visit. In the background, Emma's original drawing hung on the hospital wall, exactly as she had envisioned, a princess helping children feel better. As the ceremony concluded, families mingled in the palace gardens, sharing stories and forming connections that would continue long after the event ended. Children who had met in hospital beds played together on the grass, while parents exchanged contact information and support strategies that had helped them navigate their difficult journeys. William and Catherine moved through the crowd, stopping to talk with each family individually. They had learned the names of children who had been fighting cancer for months, remembered details about siblings who were struggling with their family's medical crisis, and checked on parents who had shared their fears and hopes during previous encounters. David Johnson found himself in conversation with another father whose son was battling the same type of leukemia that Emma had faced. As they talked, both men realized that their daughters had been patients in the same hospital ward, though at different times. The connection felt like another small miracle in a journey that had been filled with unexpected gifts, alongside devastating loss. As the sun set over Kensington Palace, the last families began to leave, carrying with them not just information about foundation services, but something more valuable, the knowledge that Emma's dream was alive and growing stronger every day. Her simple drawing had sparked a movement that was transforming how society supported families facing childhood illness. That night, Catherine hung a new picture in the family room at Kensington Palace, right next to Emma's original drawing. It was a photograph from the day's ceremony showing dozens of children playing together in the palace gardens. Some were patients, some were siblings, and some were the royal children themselves, all united in the spirit of connection and care that Emma had imagined. The moment when a nation cried had become something more, a moment when a nation chose to act with compassion, inspired by one little girl's understanding that love could make the difference between suffering alone and suffering with hope. Emma's quiet step into their hearts had stirred millions to take their own steps toward making the world a little kinder, one family at a time.